Hi folks, again a very warm welcome to the latest edition of our Generation podcast, broadcasting from Edinburgh, Scotland to the uttermost ends of the earth. And this is a podcast largely about mission, about church life, about lots of issues where we have interesting guests and we just talk about the issues of the day. We say that we are a non-celebrity podcast, but today we have made an exception. We have a celebrity. We have a published author. Let me introduce my friend John James. John is the author of this book. It's called Renewal. Okay, if you're interested in revitalization, church revitalization along the way of the cross. And John, of course, is the author of this. And we're going to talk about this book. And we're going to talk about lots of other things. John, it's great to have you with us.
Well, it's really nice to be with you. I think calling me a celebrity is going a little bit far, seeing as far as we've ascertained, you're the only person who's purchased a copy of the book. But yeah, that's fine. That's fine. We'll carry on.
Yeah, I would cheekily say that I didn't even buy it. Someone gave it to me, but I did buy it. And not only did I buy it, I recommend it to all our revitalizers, and I hope that they will fly off the shelf and provide you with a very nice pension pot at the end of it. John, tell me your story. Where were you born, bred? How did you become a Christian?
Yeah, I grew up in Scarborough in North Yorkshire, so I'm a Yorkshireman. And I became a Christian at the age of 17. So I grew up in a Christian home, and my parents really witnessed to me. But I think I kind of consciously drifted really away from through my teenage years, and then came to faith at the age of 17, and almost a few months really before then kind of leaving home and going off to university in Birmingham. And Birmingham was just massively formative in terms of my discipleship as a Christian, as a believer. And I got involved in a church plant there called City Church Birmingham in my second year as a student. That was in 1999. And that's really where I grew as a Christian. And then eventually I was sent off to Bible college, and we didn't really think we would return to Birmingham. I married a Brummie, which was to my credit, but amazingly, yeah, God kind of opened up this opportunity for us to come back to the city into a kind of church revitalization context, which was where I've been for the last 10 years, pretty much. So from 2010, and just last year we moved on from that context.
John, you don't look old enough to have been somewhere. You look, as we'd say in Scotland, like a fresh-faced loon.
Yeah.
So you were at Crossway Birmingham for 10 years. Where are you now?
Yeah, so I'm actually strangely back at City Church Birmingham, which was the church that I was involved in as a student, and have just taken on the role as the lead pastor in that context. So that church is now just over 20 years old. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a move that we kind of orchestrated or calculated would happen. We've been incredibly happy. And that's my wife and I have been kind of saying to each other, this is the happiest we've ever been in ministry, over the last few years, just really enjoying the way God's been at work in the life of the church. And of course, I think that's God's sense of humor, really. And he kind of moved us on, really, and called us into this new context, which we're delighted to follow his call on. And the church Crossway continues without us now, with our assistant pastor now stepping into the role of pastor there. So there's been a bit of a change through lockdown, really, which I think has probably been hard for the churches in question, but we trust that God knows what he's doing with us all.
Okay, so you were a student in Birmingham and then you went off to study theology. Where did you study?
Oak Hill, North London.
Yeah. Okay, so you're at Oak Hill. Tell me the story about Crossway.
Yeah.
How did the romance begin?
The romance. Well, that's a great question, actually. So for me, when I was kind of at City Church Birmingham before Bible college, and I was beginning to just sort of test a sense of calling and being given some preaching opportunities and that kind of thing, I was quite often sent to little struggling churches around Birmingham, little brethren halls and places like that, where they might appreciate a visiting preacher. And I'd kind of go and kind of give them as good as I could give them in that context, and they would sort of fall asleep or whatever whatever in the middle of it all. But genuinely, my heart was just stirred every time I visited one of these contexts, because what I discovered was, actually, they were, although they were struggling, although they were kind of disconnected very often from their local community, and also perhaps to some degree kind of not really sure what they should be doing, they were kind of they were churches that were made up of people who loved the Lord Jesus, who loved his word, were delighted just to be kind of receiving God's word together as churches, were often incredibly faithful and prayerful, and had a real godly concern for their context, even if they weren't quite sure what they should be doing. So I think even before we went off to Bible college, there was something kind of in my heart that really just was there for that situation. And then when we were at college, we were praying through all kinds of opportunities. Well, not so much opportunities. It's not like I kind of had rafts of opportunities, but we were just trying to discern what to do. And we had a heart for church planting. We had a heart for the city of Birmingham that we knew and loved. My wife is a Brummie, but we weren't quite sure what the right thing to do was. And then this kind of opportunity came upon us, really, because the church in question was the church my wife grew up in. So it used to be a little brethren hall. It had kind of got down to about 15 members, something like that. Sarah's parents, my wife Sarah, her parents were still part of the church family. And so I'd preached there a few times. I knew they had one elder left in the church, Tony. And I knew Tony a little bit, well enough to just pick up the phone, if maybe start a conversation. And we just kind of caught wind, really, of the fact that they'd given themselves about 2 years to kind of die gracefully, basically. That's kind of what they just self-consciously they'd realized what stage they were at. And so I think in that context, we just thought, well, maybe we could talk to them about not dying, or at least before you die, let's do something reckless together, kind of thing. And I think it was actually quite a good context to kind of then begin to explore a conversation in relation to church revitalization. And at the same time, we kind of had friends in the city who were trying to think about how to catalyze church planting and revitalization around the city. So a group of church pastors sort of began to launch 2020 Birmingham, which was kind of had a desire, a heart really to be a bit of a movement for church planting. And so in the end, what happened was we came back to the city. We became the first of the kind of 2020 Birmingham projects. But it was very much really the call of that local church to say, we want this, we'd like this to happen. And even though they didn't know me terribly well, they knew my wife from of old, and they kind of, I think they sort of thought, who is this punk? Probably a bit like you, kind of, he looks about 12 years old. What on earth is going on here? But at least, Sarah married the bloke, so he can't be all bad, and that was probably the basis on which the whole thing began.
Yeah, what does it say? If you don't have orthodoxy, you marry to orthodoxy. I mean, a couple of things just to get a little bit of focus. Did the church have a self-awareness of its decline? I often say that revitalization is a bit like a 12-step program in AA. Step one is to admit that you have a problem.
Yeah. I think that's really, really true. I think what I'd say is, I think amongst the leadership team that existed. I don't think it was universally shared amongst the leadership team, but effectively Tony, who was the elder there, and effectively had kind of been pastor in the church. He'd never have wanted to be sort of spoken of in those terms, but that's effectively what he'd done. And so there was recognition from him, and then other sort of key stakeholders, I'd say, were very aware. And actually later on, I kind of dug out So from their old minutes, a paper someone had written, which would just basically kind of, it was just charting kind of the trajectory in terms of individual members, just saying basically, well, we'll all be 90, or it was just really, and so there was a degree of wrestling with that. And like I say, they'd kind of given themselves 2 years to kind of die well. I think they'd also recognized that other churches like themselves had died not terribly well around them, and they kind of thought, we don't want to make that mistake. We don't want to just be a situation where it's kind of the last people left switching out the lights. How do we sort of close?
Yeah. Had it ever had a heyday as a church?
Yeah, very much so. So actually, kind of in the sort of 60s, from really the fifth. So it was planted in the 30s. The sort of 50s through to the 70s was a real heyday. It was well known as a church. It had a huge youth ministry. It had a balcony area that was, apparently packed to the rafters. And yeah, I mean, it had really flourished, I think, over the years. And in terms of its local community, it had a sort of mixed reputation. So for some people, it was it was a sort of impenetrable thing. It was this kind of thing that other people did. So it become a bit of a commuters church. People drove in on a Sunday, opened it up, and then closed it down. It's in the middle of a relatively needy kind of council estate in the south of Birmingham. So it's in the sort of top 8% most deprived communities of the UK, or something like that. So people would drive in, open up, have a service, and leave. And so it had that reputation, and people just thought. One guy said to me, I thought it was a church for judges. I said, what do you mean a church for judges? He said, well, they all wear suits. They all wear suits when they go in, And his only experience of wearing a suit had obviously been in court, So,
yeah.
But actually, that was it. So there was that kind of bit of reputation. But I think as well, there was a sense in which for local people, some of them, had grown up going to the church. It had a huge Sunday school back in its early years, and some of the old photos and things, you just kind of thought, wow, it's extraordinary, really. And I mean, the guy who cut my hair on the high street, I mean, it hasn't been cut for a long time, but that's lockdown for you. But I mean, he used to go to the Sunday school there, so we'd have great conversations about just where he was at and that kind of thing. But so it was a mixture, but I think not altogether bad at all.
Yeah.
All that.
So tell me, what were the reasons for decline? I'm thinking maybe the usual suspects. It wasn't culture relevant. The background, culture had changed. The church hadn't. Maybe there were some personality issues. Churches have got comorbidities, lots of things going on. Tell me what a few of them were.
Yeah. So I think, and this isn't a criticism necessarily of any individual, but I think there was a leadership issue. So I think I do think that's a massive issue for revitalization. Is basically if there's problems at a leadership level. So there's no kind of real they were in maintenance mode and had been for a very long time. So I think a lot of the decision making had been just tiny little decisions, one after another, after another, after another.
It's never a big thing, isn't it? It's
No,
lots of little things.
And it was just cumulatively, they were always decisions to play safe, to be a little bit more comfortable, to kind of serve the interests of those on the inside. And little incremental things. So the areas of the church that had just effectively been kind of boarded up, that we kind of needed to smash down and kind of open up again. And that was almost like a metaphor really for the way that the decision-making process had been all the way along. So I think that was a big issue. I think, the disconnect between the church family and the community in which this church met, and was seeking to kind of build bridges. There was a huge mismatch there.
Now it takes a lot of humility for a leadership, a group of folk to say, we are not cutting this anymore. Do you find that's quite common for a leadership to have that self-awareness, or is that a potential conflict area?
Well, I think what I've discovered, so I guess what we've done is not only our context, but as we've sought to tell the story a little bit, we've seen it in a few other contexts around the city as well. So there's a couple of other really fantastic kind of revitalization projects going on as well at the moment, which I'm just really thrilled by. But what I would say is that seems to be just a real, I think the talk of it is there very actually amongst a number of churches. I've spoken to lots of churches about their desire, in a sense, to see happen in their context what's happened at Crossway Church. But the difference between kind of talking about it and actually it happening, making that hard decision, is there's a huge difference between those things. And it takes a lot of courage actually just to say we're going to do this. It's risky, like humanly speaking, it's riskier to kind of, in a sense, surrender to change.
Yeah. Let me talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about hardware changes in a minute, but let me talk about software changes, specifically prayer and preaching. Is there a way in which the culture of prayer changed from the moment you went in and has subsequently developed?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the church was praying. I think it really was, and in many ways, what happened was the result of the prayers of the church. I'm convinced that we, by God's grace, He kind of really answered their prayers, perhaps not in the way that they would have wanted, but I think that yeah, I mean, that was absolutely priority. The two key priorities were to preach the Bible week in and week out. So they lived on a diet of visiting preachers with a variety of kind of I guess eccentric tendencies of one kind or another. Some actually very, very good preachers, and actually they had, we kind of made the decision together that we'd move to much more in-house, consecutive, expository preaching.
Right. So there was no coherent philosophy of ministry. There was no coherent theology.
Yeah.
So you began to get the church praying more. You began to preach through the Bible, let the Bible speak,
Absolutely.
kind of more gospel orientated stuff. Was
Just
that
let
a
the
difficult
Bible set the
process?
agenda. Yeah, I mean, it was because effectively they were having to say goodbye to some of their friends, people that they loved, preachers that they were probably better preachers than me, but actually out of a desire to kind of let the word do the work. That was my conviction coming in, was that basically we needed to let God's word set the agenda much more in terms of and also to really lead through the preaching of the word, and not, there seemed to be a disconnect between the kind of Sunday ministry and then sort of the decision making process and the leadership that was kind of existing, and I wanted to bring that very much together. And then I think prayer, I mean, we basically, the tone and the priorities within our kind of leadership team changed massively.
So did the prayer meetings look different? Were there different opportunities for prayer, like prayer triplets and so what did that look like? How did the prayer meetings change? How did the prayer culture change? Because I think we've got to go bigger than just prayer meetings. I often speak about a prayer culture. Not everyone can get to a classic Wednesday night prayer meeting.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I don't think we had a program. Well, we didn't have a sort of immense kind of program in relation to that. We did introduce prayer triplets, and we did, we tried to sort of really cultivate that prayer. I think the key area where the program prayer changed was probably within the already existing meetings. So we basically tried to put prayer front and center, and actually some exposition as well. So the word and the prayer was kind of at the heart of what we were doing, even as we met as elders, as we, in other contexts as well, which hadn't been happening. It's slightly become kind of business meetings, in one way or another. Yeah. I mean, there were a number of other things that we did, which I think all kind of feed into this, but one of them would be that we there was no formal membership in the church, so it 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 lacked clarity in terms of its kind of constitution, in terms of its own understanding. Even its statement of faith, it didn't have a formal statement of faith, so we adopted a statement of faith. One of the first things I did was preach effectively through a statement of faith, and then we adopted it together as a church family. But I mean, that, these are the kind of perils of independency, in a sense, that you're kind of getting an insight into. But I think that the reason I mention it is that actually what it meant was that we were trying to raise the level of ownership, and therefore the burden, in a sense, for prayer amongst us as a community. And I think that was a really healthy thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for any church to be revitalized, you've got prayer, you've got preaching, and these are very powerful things. You've got the oxygen of the Holy Spirit being,
Amen.
blown into the church, and things are coming alive. I'm really interested in worship, because I think singing is important. I think, it's not just superficial to say that, singing is irrelevant, that, God is the audience of our singing, which is actually not true, because we have to sing to each other as well as sing to God. So was there a change in the worship philosophy and the worship style?
There was. I mean, I mean, the culture really on a Sunday morning changed dramatically. Now, some of that just happened by virtue of the fact that a small core team of folk joined the church, and the demographic had changed. But I'm kind of 100% with you. I think joy. I can't remember who said it. Might be someone like C.S. Lewis or someone, but or maybe Jonathan Edwards. I can't. It's a bit bad that I can't remember who it is. But this idea that joy unexpressed is incomplete. And I just think there's something really in that, and I think that's one of the things that our corporate kind of singing really does. It actually allows us to express together, and complete, then, in that sense, that our kind of joy in the Lord. And my kind of heart's desire was that, it wouldn't become this thing I was driving, or this thing that I was kind of trying to beat a church into shape somehow, but it would be something God would be doing very much amongst us, recognizing that actually this chapter, in a sense, the church had existed for decades and decades, way before I'd come, and my prayer is it will exist, for many more after me. So actually, like, we're just a small piece in this story of a church that God has brought into existence, graciously, and we get to play a part in this chapter of its story, in terms of its faithfulness in, its witness in the local community.
Yeah.
And I think, so we did. I mean, in practical terms, the style, the singing, all of that changed. Yeah.
You've got a great piece in the book that speaks about planting and revitalization as being hard work, and then you ask the question provocatively, hard for who? And it's a rhetorical question, of course, because God is in the life-giving business. Can you comment a wee bit more about how your Calvinism, how your view of God has informed and inspired your ministry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really informs and inspires everything, really, that when we really consider deeply the sovereignty of God in relation to these practical outworkings. I mean, early on, the first 18 months was really difficult, and actually we had people just leave because the change was too difficult, really, for them. Some of it was to do with kind of specifically a kind of loss of power, a sense of how, the kind of difference between talking about change and then the reality of change, and that kind of thing. And some of it was just, they just didn't like the direction. They didn't like where things were heading. They wanted in a sense, preserve the way things used to be. And I think in those first 18 months, in terms of what was practically on display, like we had, I think, 5 funerals. I mean, this age of, we were small. We had 5 funerals, no baptisms, no one joined the church, and I think people were looking at me thinking, who is this guy? He's killing us all off one by one.
The Undertaker.
Exactly, the Undertaker's arrived. But actually, just trusting in the sovereignty of God in all of that, and that his ordained means, his means of grace are enough, and to just believe that actually things done his way, that's all we can do. In effect, was very, very helpful to me. And then things did turn a corner. We got to see God work in miraculous ways, in wonderful ways in the life of the church. But yeah, that sense of someone said to me, it's easier to give birth than raise the dead, was their phrase, as if to say, go plant a church, don't this, revitalization is kind of is pointless, really. Just go plant a church. And that was really the thing where I just thought, for whom is it easier? Genuinely.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, if we believe in a God who absolutely delights to raise the dead, I mean, that is, it's on every page of the Bible.
Yeah.
The God
Yeah.
we believe in. It's a God who gives life, and the Spirit is the giver of life. I just think, if we don't believe that I mean, you need that if you're planting a church anyway. I mean, every Christian ministry requires that. But I think there's actually something really thrilling about being part of something that kind of demonstrably requires the resurrection power of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Absolutely. We're talking about a miracle situation, because it's only God that can do this. You've got another, there's so many good things in the book, I can't begin to explain it, but you've got another really good book about, I think you're explaining the connection between the sovereignty of God and human strategy. And you're saying, we don't plant jelly beans or rocks. The seed is important. And it seems to me that you had a sensitivity about strategy. You planted good seeds. How important is strategy? And I'm overflowing a little bit here, maybe in your city church job now. How important is strategy in your own ministry philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because I slightly waver on this, I have to say. Like, I think there've been times when I've thought strategy is kind of everything, and
Yeah.
strategy eats vision for breakfast kind of mentality, and all of that. And I do agree with that. I really do. I think, and actually coming into a new context, that's also really evident. I think what I'd say, though, is that cultural change, there's no easy way. Like, there's no strategy alone is not enough, really, for cultural change. And if the change you're trying to bring in is, in a sense, gospel change, or change that you pray will produce a culture that reflects the goodness of God, say, that kind of idea, then actually it's just slow, it's just long term, and strategies deployed will be multiple. a myriad of different options will be going. But actually, what probably matters more than anything else is your character in the midst of it all. I've found that it's not what you do, it's kind of how you do it, really, that's as important as the actual strategy itself. It's you as the person in the mix as well.
Yeah.
And I think we sometimes underplay that. So I think we underplay kind of what you as an individual bring into the mix of the context that you're in. But I think probably actually the most important thing we can do is just guard our own hearts, seek to be as demonstrably kind of reliant on God in the midst of everything that we're doing. Probably not actually think you've got all the answers, but in terms of, my kind of strategic plan or whatever else, I think strategy is essential. Don't mishear me.
Yeah.
But I think that alone it's not enough, I think. And
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's like driving a manual car. You've got 3 pedals, you've got an accelerator, brake, and clutch. The actual quote, I think, is Drucker's quote: "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." So, one of your pedals, culture, one of them's character, and one of them's strategy. So it's a judicious use of all 3, and that's really important, isn't it?
Yeah, that's great. You've just corrected the quote that I clearly got incredibly wrong. But that's that is the point. Culture is is everything, really. And actually, what the way that you change culture is I honestly think there are these sort of make or break moments, really, where it is a lot to do with your courage and your willingness to just demonstrably kind of be God's man in the middle of it all, really.
And be different, because if you think of Jesus was so utterly independent and
Yes.
different. He didn't speak like the other religious leaders. He followed his own star. Okay, he was the Messiah, the Son of God. He had a big star. But if we have to be Christ-like, so edginess doesn't come from skinny jeans and red Converse.
Yeah.
Edginess comes from that just God-given character and boldness. And I used to think that boldness was the ability to shout and scream, but it's no. Jesus had a different boldness, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is the we model that in the way that we conduct ourselves, and that conviction, really, from God that he's put you here to do what he's asking you to do, not to just simply please other people or follow out the kind of follow the desires of what others are asking of you, but instead to just say no, this is what God is asking us to do. And I think we need to really stay close to the Lord in that.
Now, people pleasing is a huge idol in folks' lives. I mean, I don't know if you struggle with that. I do. Most folk do. How do we, as fellow people pleasers, overcome that?
Well, I think some of it is a bit of, like, for me, some of it's a kind of messianic complex, that I think I even have the power to sort of ability to somehow make everyone happy, which is just a nonsense. I mean, it's utterly ridiculous when you stop and think about it. And actually, there was a point for me where I had to really just take stock of, like, the way that I was working and the way that I was just throwing myself into stuff. I went to see the GP, and she kind of said to me, and I was just completely run down, and been like this way for ages, and I was just sharing. She said, "Well, what do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a church pastor." And she sort of rolled her eyes at me and kind of said, "Well, how many hours do you work?" I said, gave a vague number, and then she kind of said, "Well, when did you last have a day off?" And I kind of sort of slightly looked at the ceiling and looked a bit sheepish, and she looked at me, and this is my GP. I don't think she's a believer at all, but she looked at me and she said, "You don't need to save the world today, John." And I kind of thought, what do you mean? And I thought, oh, this is a wonderful opportunity. I can tell her all about it. It's all right. Actually, somebody already has, And then I kind of thought, no, that's exactly my problem. That is exactly my problem. That I think I am the Messiah, basically.
Yeah. I love the words of John. John the Baptist says, "Guys, I am not the Christ." I can't do it.
I am not the Christ. Absolutely. And so, I mean, for me, that's I think the only way to kill that idol is to really believe that he is the Christ, actually, and that
But isn't it hard to drop plates? If these plates are sometimes not plates, but people, you know, to recognize that you're not going to do it, that, you know, there are certain people who could have a full-time pastor working on them 24/7 for years.
Yeah.
Is there ever a time to walk away?
Yes, I think there absolutely is. I think that it's not, though. When you say kind of is dropping people or walking away from people, I think if we understand the dynamic to be one in which um, our responsibility is continually to point people to someone else, then actually it may well be that there are other, if we're equipping a church family, say, to that task, then it's not just one person's responsibility. We can play that role. There may be ways I can continue to play that role, certainly through my preaching or in other interactions. But to be that person sort of day in, day out, actually to say, well, the person, the Savior, has not dropped them. That's one thing we can say for sure. And actually, if my responsibility is to equip a body for works of service, then there'll be others who can point them to Christ as well.
But I guess, even Jesus, there were certain conversations, the rich young ruler, he looked at him, he loved him, he told his piece, and then he moved on. He did move on from people.
Yeah.
Sometimes physically we've got to move on, but as you say, you've got that conversation as other folk in the church. People themselves have to pick up a bit of responsibility for their own lives.
And to some degree, that's been what I've had to grapple with moving on from Crossway, having been there for 10 years, just saying it's someone else's responsibility now at this point. And that's been really, really hard. I mean, it's been a sort of season of grief, really, to have to do that. But
I mean, trust me, it is liberating. I was in the same church for 31 years. I was a planter, and I stayed with that church for 31 years. But I loved it. We left well. It's been liberating, actually, knowing that it's God's church, and it's thrived since I moved on. I think I've thrived. Everybody's done well. There's seasons that you move on.
Well, I heard it thrived because you'd moved on. That was
There's a bit of truth in that. I said to the new guy, who's also a really good friend, says, "Let's just don't screw up," and he hasn't. Too bad. Do you like ministry? Do you enjoy it? I mean, do you say to your wife sometimes, "Hey, this is fun"?
Yeah, I really do. I'll be honest with you. I love ministry most of the time. And actually, before we left kind of Crossway, we'd been saying to each other, "This is the happiest we've ever been in ministry." At this point, the last few years at Crossway were just really, really rich ones. And I think we'd kind of I think we just allowed ourselves to enjoy some of the fruit of the labor. We'd kind of really toiled away in those early years, and then it was then became just a kind of church, local church, and then we just really started to enjoy all the implications of that. But I think God has a sense of humor, doesn't he, in terms of then moving us on, or saying, yes, well, it's time for something new. I think in our new context, I think in the middle of lockdown, I think it's been difficult. It's been a difficult move, and we face big challenges as a church as we kind of work out the future together. As I work out what it means to be kind of
Now, you're at City Church Birmingham. Is that the church that John Stevens was involved in back in the day? Yeah. How difficult is it, going back? You were the boy when you went there. Now you're lead pastor.
I know. I was their first ever ministry trainee. So like, just bonkers, really. And nobody would have imagined it, I think. Least of all me. Well, yeah. So it's strange, but I think the thing that I mean, it's a church with quite a high turnover, so there aren't that many people who kind of knew me from before. Um, it's kind of a church with sort of hub church sensibilities in a sense. So it does a lot of kind of raising up and sending out. It has a thriving student ministry, and I think one of my prayers coming in is that actually, um, as a church, it has been really helpful in terms of catalyzing revitalization around the city. And I think my heart is that kind of actually we'll be able to continue to do that, and that will be sort of one of the joys of ministry in this context. But it's strange. Yeah, it's a little bit strange. I think we're all adjusting to it. But
Are you allowed to meet physically in England just now?
so it's possible to. Yeah, it is. But we don't own our own building, so we would normally meet in a school, and they're not letting us meet at the moment. We were meeting in a cinema for a little bit, because they sort of said that they'd let us in, but they're closed at the moment. So at the moment, we're live streaming everything. Yeah.
Yeah. How important are buildings? By that I mean, how important is it, number one, to have one? I think increasingly they are, by the way. How important is the look of the building? Like Crossway, did the building change? Did that impact the culture?
Yeah. So at Crossway, the building was really important. I think because we had a building, we basically tried to leverage that as kind of, in terms of mission and in terms of our presence in the local community as much as we possibly could, and found that there were real strengths to that. So the building is not very attractive. It's not very impressive at all. But in terms of that estate, so council estate of around 4,000 homes, it's the only there's one other community facility, which is smaller than ours, and there are no other churches that meet on that estate. So the Anglican Church got burnt down it was before me. It was nothing to do with me, and it got burnt down. Whatever the rumours are, but that 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 meant that basically we were the only kind of Christian presence, if you like, on the estate. I think bricks and mortar to kind of make a bit of a statement for a community like that. They say that we're here for the long haul. We're not going anywhere. We're not a transient thing. We just here. And a lot of people basically regarded us as their kind of parish church. I mean, we married people and stuff, just who were people in the community and had great opportunities. I in some ways I kind of became the guy who did people's funerals locally and that kind of stuff, because you just get known in that way and linked.
But I mean, I think an independent church can be the parish church. I often say that the parish church is not necessarily, as we have in Scotland, the Church of Scotland, or in England, the C of E. The parish church is a church in the locality that cares for that community, and we should have that parish mentality.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely the approach we took at Crossway. And so we effectively kind of worked out what our parish was, in that sense, and kind of gave ourselves to that. With City, I think we're still, got to work all that out. Really, it's a different kind of model of ministry, and I think in some ways it's kind of a church that has two kind of focuses. It's a church that's existed now for well over 20 years, so it's got people who are very settled, very much rooted in the city, care for the city, care for their communities, and figuring out then how we basically resource ministry in the front line well in that context without a building is difficult. Although we actually do have a few buildings, but they're not big enough for a whole church to meet in.
Yeah. So you went there in October. Am I right in saying then that you've never seen your congregation together physically?
That's exactly right. I mean, we met for a month in October in the cinema, in the Odeon cinema, So that was like a massive high priority for me, was to try and get us to meet physically, because
Like, was everyone together in October?
well, no, because there wasn't room, and with social distancing, we had to have tickets and all that. So yeah, so the closest really we've got has been members meetings on Zoom. So that tells you, and that's not very close to reality.
Well, we're Presbyterians. We don't have members meetings all once a year. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's been hard it's been hard just preaching. Actually, I feel incredibly de-skilled as a pastor. All the soft skills that I just would be so reliant on for ministry, I just feel like they've all been taken from me because we're on screens. But that's the situation. In one sense, it's an opportunity to trust even more in the sovereignty of God, and in the midst of these things, as I'm preaching to a camera, thinking, I believe in the Holy Spirit. I believe in the authoritative word of God. I'm just trying to be faithful here, and you do what you want to do, Lord. But it's difficult. Yeah, that's the challenge now.
So this book then, Renewal, are you hearing how it's going? Do you ever get any feedback?
I mean, it's 5 years old now, so yeah, I get feedback, and people get in touch from time to time. It was nice that you got in touch and wanted to talk about it. I mean, that's lovely. But yeah, I mean, I think it's weird when I've written another book since then about basically sort of church movement, church planting movements, and that kind of thing, which was really our story of 2020 Birmingham. But and I wrote that with Neil Powell. But they just kind of have a life of their own after that. You just kind of have to believe this was something worth doing, and that the Lord will use it. It was a slightly accidental thing in the first place, because I'd written some articles for the FIEC, and effectively the articles were too long, and I had more to say, and they kind of encouraged me to go down this route. So it wasn't something I'd aspirations for at all, really. But it's nice to hear that it gets used, and it does get used in a few different places, I think.
I mean, I like it when leadership groups take it and go through it and just use it as a manual, use some of the stuff, critique it, bump against it. Absolutely. John, thanks for giving us time today. Folk, again, I'll put all this product placement, Renewal by John James. If you want to know what John is doing these days, again, Google City Church Birmingham. There's got a very funky website that you can look in and listen to his preaching. The book in the Church Planting Movement I've read also, and it's certainly worth reading. John, thank you so much for giving us time today.
Well,
we wish you every blessing.
Thanks very much.
Have you ever been in Scotland?
My sister lives in Glasgow. She's married to a Glaswegian. So yeah, and we absolutely love holidays on a Scottish island. So we've been to Islay, and we've been to Skye, and we've been to Arran, and so I absolutely love what I've seen of Scotland. Yeah.
If you have been to Skye and you have been to Glasgow, really you have arrived.
Yeah. Well, I feel like it, honestly. Love it.
John, thank you so much for giving us your time, and we will head off. Generation Podcast folk, again, thank you for listening, for viewing. Our video thing is experimental. I'm not a great fan of videos. More the old school podcast type. Give us your feedback. Do you like the videos? Will we scrap it? Will I have to go into makeup before we do the videos in future? Thank you, and tune in next week. Thank you for giving us time.